Welcome back, chemistry students. Today we're going to get into part 3 of cell cycle on cell regulation. Let me share my screen with you and we'll get started. This will not be a very long session, but it's going to cover some really important things. We're looking at the regulation of the cell cycle. Now, if you recall, the cell cycle had 3 major phases, and each phase the cell is going to receive a signal as to what to do next, whether it should repair, grow, terminate, or mutate. And so our objective today is to be able to define cell regulation and determine when the cell is ready to divide. After these notes and discussions, you'll have a recap of cell regulation, and I've got that loaded on quizzes for you through your Google Classroom. Remember 7 tips for effective studying, spiral notebook for your notes, pens and highlighters, watch the video lesson, pause as needed, review the slides in present mode, email any questions to me and I'll get back to you on those pretty quickly, and complete the assignment in the next tab. And remember, complete the assignment before you submit it. So we're now in part 3 on our discussion of cell cycle and cancer. And this is on cell regulation. Let's go back and review cell cycle. All cells come from other cells, and once the egg becomes fertilized, that zygote goes through cell division repeatedly. Cell division can give rise to many identical cells. Differentiation is a process that creates special structures and functions, and specialized cells become tissues, that become organs, that become organ systems. Cells need to grow and repair. The cell cycle occurs in those 3 main phases of interphase, mitosis, and cytokinesis. And the chromosomes have all the DNA they need to duplicate every cell in the body. So let's talk about how do cells know when to divide and when not to. We call that regulation of the cell cycle. So let's find out. There are 2 groups of proteins called cyclins and cyclin-dependent kinases, or CDKSs. We don't need to get into a lot of the details of it, but they are responsible for the progress of the cell through various checkpoints. And the cyclins regulate the cell cycle only when they are tightly bound to CDKS. And so if you go back and look at the cell cycle, we've got gap phase and synthesis phase and G2 phase. And then we get into mitosis, which has the prophase, the metaphase, the anaphase, the telophase, and the back end of it is the cytokinesis. So during these phases, they're going to need the proteins to tell the cell what to do. The cell cycle is controlled by that chemical control system, those proteins called cyclins, that start and stop events in the cell cycle. There are some signals that come from the outside of the cell, and that's known as external regulation. Those can be hormones or nutrients. They come from outside the cell, transfer into the cell with proteins. Then there's the internal regulation. Those are the signals that come from the nucleus. Remember, the nucleus holds all of the DNA, which are all of the instructions. Now there are checkpoints. And a checkpoint is a critical point where stop and go signals can regulate that cycle. And if any of you have ever done any computer programming, you'll know that there is a series of checkpoints along the way within a set of instructions. And note that cell division is mostly in the off position during prophase. And in animal cells, if there is no stimulus present, it's going to stay in the off position. It's just waiting to get a go signal. Now, we've been talking about how cells grow and repair, but how do cells die? Well, there are 2 ways that a cell can die. The first way is what's known as necrosis, and the second is apoptosis. Necrosis occurs when a cell is damaged by an external force, such as a poison or a bodily injury, an infection, or getting cut off from the blood supply that carries the oxygen, which might occur during a heart attack or a stroke. And when cells die from necrosis, it's a rather messy process. The death causes inflammation of other cells that can cause some further distress or injury within the body. Now, in the diving that I do, many commercial divers, these are guys that do diving for their job, over time, because of the extreme pressures that the body is put under underwater, they develop bone necrosis. And bone necrosis is where the cells in the bones start to die and the bones become brittle. So necrosis is another term that we use for when a cell is damaged by an external force. The other way cells die is through what is known as apoptosis. It's a relatively civil way that a cell dies, even though it may not sound so at first. And it's when a cell essentially terminates itself. The cell knows that it's not going to survive, so it gets its signals to self-destruct. So how's that better than necrosis? Well, for one thing, the cleanup is a lot easier in the body. It's sometimes referred to as programmed cell death. And the process of apoptosis follows a controlled and predictable routine. Let's take a look at that routine. If we look here at our illustration, we have the cell, and the cells are damaged or distressed or triggered by body signals that begin apoptosis. The cell begins to shrink and form what are known as blebs. Blebs are a bulge in the plasma membrane of a cell. And then the cell then starts to self-destruct. But the proteins are activated to break down the cellular components. Then enzymes break down the nucleus, and the cell starts to emit signals to attract macrophages. The cell then breaks into several smaller pieces containing the cell components and the destroyed nucleus. And ultimately, the macrophages recognize the cell parts and remove them from the body. And so the apoptosis process is a process where the cell gets a signal and says, hey, I'm really not forming properly. It's time to self-destruct. Now, sometimes during that apoptosis process, when it gets those internal and external signals, it activates those genes that produce the self-destructive enzymes. And the nucleus starts to shrink and it starts to break apart. But because that cell is being programmed to no longer duplicate, some things can happen, deformities can happen in the body. Some people will get webbed fingers and toes during early development. Remember, we're not all perfect. Okay? Things don't work all the time. And sometimes when a cell knows it's not supposed to survive, it knows to die off and let other cells start to take over the job. So let's review cell regulation. Cell cycle is controlled by a chemical control system, which includes proteins called cyclins that start and stop the events of the cell cycle. External regulation, those are signals that come from outside the cell, from either hormones or nutrients. Internal regulation are signals that come from the nucleus, such as the DNA inside the cell. It sends out instructions of what that cell is supposed to do during that cycle. So what I'd like you to do is to review your notes, then go into the cell regulation and apoptosis recap. You'll find that in the next assignment tab. It clicks into quizzes. You'll have about 3 minutes per question. It shouldn't take that long to do. And remember, you get up to 3 tries to improve your score, and you should be competing against your other classmates. That's kind of fun to do. Tomorrow, we'll move into cancer cells. Well, that's all I have for you today, guys. If you have any questions along the way, please make sure you email me and I'll get back to you quickly. Other than that, I'm Mr. Silverstein, and you guys go have a great day.